Dulce et Decorum est by Wilfred Owen. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dream you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
Hi, welcome to Litpoetry and our discussion of the poem Dulce et Decorum est by Wilfred Owen. This poem paints a ghastly image of the horrors of war, and its subtle use of rhythms and disturbing imagery almost act as a time machine, transporting the reader to one of the worst times and places imaginable. Hell on earth, the front lines of trench warfare during World War I. So take a deep breath and let's go on that journey together. To fully appreciate and understand Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum est, we must first consider the historical context in which it was written. Owen, an Englishman, fought on the Western Front during World War I, and Dulce et Decorum est was written as a part of a longer series of poems that address war and specifically the lives of soldiers. Wilfred Owen was hospitalised while writing these poems, recovering from shell shock. The poem's vivid detail of the horrors of war and underlying message that it is not honourable to die for your country was controversial and ran contrary to the military recruitment propaganda spread by Britain and other major powers throughout that period, which preyed on the nationalism fostered throughout the 19th century. In fact, the poem was written in response to one of Owen's contemporaries, Jessie Pope, whose patriotic poems were used to drum up new male recruits for the war effort. In the original first draft of the poem that has been preserved over time, you can actually see how Owen addressed the poem originally to Jessie Pope herself. The draft also reveals the poet as he grapples for the right words to express what is almost inexpressible. Dulce et Decorum est was probably written in response to the war recruitment poems of Jessie Pope's, in particular, Who's for the Game, which paints a highly romantic and idealised picture of war, comparing, in that particular poem, war to a game and calling on men to not miss out on the fun. Right from the opening line, Owen's poem juxtaposes Pope's patriotic message and her idealised rendition of strong, heroic, noble and proud English soldiers with the image of tired, worn out and broken men limping back from a stint on the front lines. Of course, Pope's idea of the tall and heroic English soldier was also immortalised in the recruitment posters of the time. Through his experiences of war in the trenches, Owen became convinced that the Great War must be ended. This was a controversial stance. Conscientious objectors were reviled and even imprisoned. In 1918, the same year Dulce et Decorum est was written, the philosopher Bertrand Russell was jailed for pacifist agitation. Social pressure was intense. Young men who didn't enlist throughout England were often shamed publicly by women and given white feathers as a mark of cowardice. For Owen, as a poet, it was imperative that he rebuke this kind of pro-war sentiment in two ways. One, by making it clear that he himself lacked no courage, and two, by giving an honest, detailed account of the kind of horrors trench combat actually condoned. Owen's work in general speaks to the disillusionment and questioning evident in the modernist movement in literature of the time, as well as an interest in playing with the structure of traditional forms. Owen also formed a friendship with the established war poet Siegfried Sassoon, who took him under his wing and mentored him. Together they worked on and talked about pacifist literature, and they put themselves up against the canon of pro-war poetry of that time that glorified the act of sacrificing one's life in war, championing a form of intense realism in their poetic styles. Soon after writing the majority of his poems, Owen returned to combat in France. In November 1918, 1 week before the armistice was declared, Owen died, killed in action.
Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind.
Owen uses his own perspective on the hardships and sufferings of war to vividly capture a realistic scene of soldiers retreating from the front lines in search of some distant rest. His disjointed and stuttering start to the poem lifts the profile of the poem as an anti-war piece by challenging the stereotypical image of dignity and masculinity commonly used to portray soldiers at the time. Rather than creating strong, noble, Adonis-like figures of patriotic pride like the poet Jesse Pope, Owen constructs his words in a way that lets the person reading the poem imagine what the soldiers were actually going through. He uses harsh, guttural and sonically rich words, an awkward, irregular rhythm, and seemingly haphazard caesura, in other words punctuation, to create a vision of the front line stripped back of any glory. The soldiers struggle through the mud. They are bent double, like beggars under sacks, or like old crippled women coughing like hags. And both of these terms, beggars and hags, are very derogatory. They diminish the idea of the proud soldier. The onomatopoeia of words such as coughing, curse and sludge, where the words actually sound like the actions they are trying to describe, instill a very visceral image in the reader's mind. These words actually work to transport the reader to the front lines, who then get to bear witness to the soldiers struggling through the mud and the filth. Owen uses consonants within the onomatopoeic sort of soundscape as well to add to this overall effect and to lend a harshness to the sound of the poem. In the first line, the letter B appears in 3 stressed words: bent, double and beggars. And this gives way to a very hard sound with the C and the Ks, with sacks, coughing, cursed, and backs. Although the K sounds of knock need, should be kind of silent, they actually contribute. They're harsh. They can contribute visually to the hard consonants of this section. Owen also uses punctuation and caesura quite masterfully to alter and disrupt the normal flow and tempo of the poem. The injection of several commas in the opening stanza, particularly the first few lines, disrupts the flow of the poem and creates this uneasy, nauseating rhythm which mimics the sluggish, drunken movement of the soldiers towards their distant place of rest. The first full stop is not until the end of the fourth line, creating a drawn-out opening sentence which highlights and accentuates the soldier's lack of reprieve. By playing with the natural iambic pentameter, typical of poems from that period, now pentameter is like a heartbeat type of meter we associate typically with sonnets and Shakespearean verse, Owen masterfully cuts off any notion of fluidity and grace right off at the knees. It is an extraordinary opening. We can actually see the iambic pentameter underpinnings of the poem in a later line. In all my dreams before my helpless sight. Now I've accentuated that a bit. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, but you can hear the natural heartbeat rhythm. In this line you can hear the 5 heartbeats, the dums, and how they infect and make the line sound so beautiful. This type of rhythm, of course, has the reputation for being almost sublime, with Shakespeare, as I've already mentioned, its great champion. Think of the Shakespearean line, for instance, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" That is iambic pentameter in a nutshell. But in Dulce et Decorum est, Owen regularly diverges from this meter in many subtle ways. And in doing so, he is implying that life on the front lines is an abomination to the natural rhythms of a well-lived life. Warfare is an offence to our very nature as human beings. And that is just one way that this poem is a masterpiece. It communicates as much through its broken rhythm as through its words. Moving on, the first stanza of the poem elaborates on the physical condition of the soldiers. The speaker emphasises their weariness through the use of hyperbole. The soldiers are not actually asleep, lame, blind, drunk, or deaf, but the extreme conditions they are experiencing make these descriptions feel accurate. Another way to read these hyperbolic statements is that the trauma of war makes them actually feel lame, blind, drunk, and deaf, even if in a strictly physical sense they are not. The soldiers are also described as dispirited, bloodshot beasts of burden who have been stripped of their human dignity, devoid of hope, pride, and purpose. In this description of being bloodshot, Owen is making a connection to how horses are shod with horseshoes. The men are akin, therefore, to livestock who are off to the slaughterhouse, basically. Their trench-foot-infested feet encased in blood. The overall image here is almost that of the Walking Dead. The war has deadened the men and reduced them to animals, even if it hasn't yet killed them. The last few lines of the first stanza introduce a new danger with the dropping of gas shells, weapons that release poison gases like chlorine and mustard gas. The soldiers are so desensitised at this point that they don't even hear the shells dropping, and therefore they aren't fully aware of their danger until it's almost too late. This highlights the horror of war, which is so deeply traumatic. The soldiers don't even discern an immediate threat to their lives.
Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning.
Owen cleverly alters the rhythm of the poem again at the beginning of the second stanza, as he describes a gas attack. Without protection, poison gas was lethal. Even moderate exposure could damage a soldier's eyes, nose, throat and lungs. The gas masks that the men had to put on to protect themselves were bulky and suffocating. Because of this, soldiers would have to move quickly to get their masks on at the first sign of gas. The short, sharp burst of "Gas, gas, quick boys!" is punctuated by multiple exclamation marks, conveying this panic in a realistic way that echoes the rush of adrenaline that would have been experienced by the soldiers. Owen describes the panic to put on gas masks as an ecstasy of fumbling. Of course, ecstasy is usually used to describe an overwhelming sense of joy or pleasure. The soldiers fumbling to put on their masks are completely overwhelmed by terror, vividly aware of their mortal danger for the first time in the poem. War has taken what is usually a word connotating joy and turned it into terror. It's a very devastating statement. Furthermore, the stressed syllables in the metre of line 9 create a percussive effect like little explosions of sound on the page. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. The effect of these explosive words appears in other places in the poem as well, and it mirrors the sounds that are coming from the battlefield, where shellfire punctuates the days and the nights. The poem itself actually sounds like a battlefield, and this is remarkable writing. Owen weaves an extended analogy throughout his description of the gas attack, describing being amongst the poisonous fumes as under a green sea. Once Owen puts his gas mask on, it is as if he has entered an underwater environment, creates a really dramatic pause in line 13, signifying the transition into a new alien world of a sea full of danger and the potential for drowning. The misty pains of the mask disconnect him from the horror of the ocean around him and from the man in some ways floundering ironically like a fish out of water, drowning. Owen goes further to describe the scene with great intensity, using a 3-punch sequence of guttering, choking, drowning. These words are filled with emotion and contain an onomatopoeic edge filled with harsh consonant sounds that get stuck in your mouth and are hard to dislodge. Pay close attention to the G, T, Ch, K and D sounds. It's truly evocative writing that transports you once again very viscerally into this horrific scene. The speaker initially uses 2 similes to try to describe the gas soldier in addition to the drowning analogy. The first is like a man in fire, which communicates the intensity of the man's suffering. The man moves as if he is literally on fire. The speaker thinks next of lime, an alkaline substance that burns human tissue it comes in contact with. Owen therefore, in some ways, uses the gas attack in 2 ways, in both burning and drowning, and thereby amplifies how bad the suffering actually is, shining a light on the horrific and decidedly inglorious nature of death in war. Finally, in line 15, the poem suddenly shifts to a 3rd stanza, and the speaker shifts the poem in 2 ways, from the past to the present tense, and from the description of the exterior world to a description of the speaker's own interior world. These 2 lines reveal the speaker's current dramatic reality, in which, having survived the previous gas attack, he now has recurrent nightmares about the gas soldier his earlier story describes. The images are inescapable, appearing in all his dreams, and highlight the enduring ramifications of war that can haunt a person for the rest of their life.
if in some smothering dream you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
In the final stanza of the poem, Owen uses rich imagery to illustrate the horror of disposing of his dead comrade's body, inviting the reader to join him in his smothering dreams. The use of the word flung is intended to have a heavy impact on the reader, as it displays with clarity the sheer inhumanity of war. Owen and his fellow soldiers being so broken and fatigued, they are forced to fling their dead comrade in a wagon like a piece of meat, the white eyes writhing in his face. The brutal horror of the scene is exemplified by Owen comparing the dying soldier's face to a devil sick of sin, an oxymoron which shockingly conveys the utter despair of the soldier, as a devil is often represented as being sin incarnate. But in this case, human behaviour is so much more abhorrent than his own evil nature. Owen concludes the poem by referring to Jesse Pope as my friend, and labelling the title of the poem Dulce et Decorum est, which is a Latin phrase that translates into the saying, it is sweet and fitting to die for your country. Here he refers to this Latin phrase as the old lie, and something that Pope, if she experienced the same things that Owen did, would not be so quick to endorse. It is worth taking a moment also to note that Owen capitalises the word lie here, which gives it extra definition. In other words, this isn't any old lie, it's the old lie, the granddaddy of them all. It is the lie that death in war is glorious and honourable, and the implication is that it is a lie told by those who are powerful, so that when those leaders need armies in order to either protect or expand their power, they have willing young men to fill their ranks. The words Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori are a quotation from Horace. Horace's original poem celebrates bravery and resilience in battle, with cheerful generalisations about the perils of war. But including the original lines of the poem, Owen evokes how far back into history the myth of glorious patriotic death goes, and therefore how deeply ingrained it is in modern culture. Final thoughts. Poetry, while the shortest of literary forms, is arguably the most profound in its ability to convey rich meaning in a beautiful and yet sometimes disturbing way. Dulce et decorum est is a case in point. Owen transports the reader directly to the front lines of the war in a harrowing fashion that shakes you to your very core. He strips away the reader's ability to see anything ennobling about war, because he shows war for what it truly is, a horror show, a squalid, terror-filled horror show. He shows a vision of man's capacity to slaughter his fellow man. And so when we see nations of people gathered still today to remember the fallen, what better poem than this to be recited to the crowds than this one? It is an antidote to the glorification, patriotism and identity making that sometimes lies under the surface of such events. Owen helps us to remember war for what it really, truly is, lest we forget.